again, like when I first accepted that job, I was very clear on like I will not straighten my hair until I scored my first on-camera interview. And I didn't straighten my hair for almost a year. And I scored my first on-camera interview thanks to Isabelia Herrera, who's also a Dominican woman. And it was live. It was with that De La Ghetto. And I remember posting it and it being such a big moment because everyone was just like, this is so you. Like the outfit, the hair, like, and so many people were part of my journey.
Yo, welcome to another episode of the Plurawl podcast. The clip in the intro that you heard is with this week's guest, none other than Jennifer Mota. I've been following Jennifer for a minute. On top of the dope work that she puts out, the swag and the energy is something that's hard to miss. She's one of those people that bring the swag and the substance to whatever she does. Jennifer Mota is a Dominican-American multimedia journalist. Some would even call her a culture shifter. She first garnered tons of media attention in 2019 for an article that she did, Recognizing Dominican Dembow, from Jamaica to Alfa. It was the first investigative deep dive into the genre, which now is all over the place. Since then, she's been featured for a ton of different publications. And if you want to learn more about her work, her background, be sure to check out the show notes of this week's episode. There's a full bio in there. But I don't want to get too into it because I want to get y'all right into this dope conversation. All right, check it out.
I'll start with the question that I always ask folks. The word authenticity, right? It's a buzzword. You hear it everywhere. But what does it mean to you? When you hear the word, what comes to mind?
When it comes to authenticity, I built an entire career and existence around being myself. And when we think about authenticity, it's who are you? And how does that relate to a community? How does it relate to people? How does it relate to your career? Is it marketing? Is it branding? And it's hard to not think about career and your livelihood when you hear the word authenticity, but especially in today's age where there's content creators, music, everything everything around us relates to authenticity. Your politics and how you run in politics, how you vote in politics, how you organize in politics, literature. What kind of literature do you read and how does that relate to your authenticity, But to me, when it comes to authenticity, it's really understanding who you are, what your core values are, what your beliefs are, and how do you tie that into your lifestyle? How do you spend your day? How do you relate to other people? How do you build community? And how you choose to build your life around that, ultimately.
That's so fascinating that you said that you built a career on it, right? But that I'm sure came later on, right? So let's take a step back and even think about growing up. Do you think growing up, were you allowed to be yourself?
It's interesting because I have immigrant parents.
From where?
Dominican Republic. Just so I could kind of break it down real fast. My mom is Washington Heights, Dominican York. She's like the perfect island to NYC pipeline immigrant story. She was like 14, 15. So she came to New York pretty young. She had her boyfriend back in DR, which was like my dad. Both of my parents grew up in rural spaces of El Cibao in the Dominican Republic, which, it's a different kind of poverty where it's like they didn't have access to a lot of things, but they had like land. So they ate what they grew. My mom came in a time where it was all about the American dream. So experiencing New York was very different from what she grew up around. And she didn't want to go back to the Dominican Republic. So she was on time. Yeah, I'm raising my daughter in NYC, which is me. And my dad was just like really against coming here because he himself was also a journalist. And understood how much of like capitalism and how the United States have played such a big role in like disrupting and damaging so many Latin American countries and interfering in countries, including the Dominican Republic. So he was totally against coming to the States. But my mom was just like, yeah, like, if you don't come, another man's gonna raise her. I'm like, that's my daughter. I'm gonna go raise her.
Wait, do you remember when did you have those conversations with your mom and dad?
So this is the thing, like, they never let me forget. It's part of that immigrant experience where like the immigrant parents is selfless, but they also remind you how much they have sacrificed. Because it's like, don't look bad.
Yeah, it's like, yo, I had a whole life over here and I left it for you.
And like, it's the typical immigrant story. A lot of Dominicans who were lawyers, doctors, you know, my dad was a journalist and he was also like a social, he was the social community person back in DR, and he gave that up and moved here for a different kind of opportunity. And it was more relating to family. So a lot of Dominicans, when they travel, they have to give up their old professional careers. They don't practice law. They don't practice medicine unless they go through the extensive process that they have to here. And they
All over.
bodega owners. So they became bodega owners. So I'm a bodega baby. I grew up in the bodega lifestyle here in Philly. So a lot of my early years was like very East Coast, embedded in East Coast and traveling back and forth. You know, I was born in New York. I have a lot of family in South Jersey. And then we were the family that ended up in Philly, and we were the only family out of everybody that had ended up there. So my parents never let me forget that they sacrificed things. But I think that my parents created a space for me to be very proud of where I came from, and never forget where I came from and who I was. You know, like, I feel like in very subtle ways, my parents reminded me that I always would have to try 10 times harder than the average person around me because of what I look like, because I was a woman, and, you know, just how society don't expect much from Latina women, especially around that time. They always expected, especially in Philly, there was always the stereotype that like Latina teenagers were always going to be young mothers that didn't really go after a professional career. So those things were never like, that was always a conversation. So I think when it comes to, was I allowed to be fully myself? No. And I think that was mainly out of fear. As immigrants' parents, you know, especially if I put myself in their shoes, when you give up, I don't know what it would be like for me to give up my life. You know, like, my parents were so selfless that now I have the privilege to be creative, if that makes sense. Like, I didn't have,
Right.
I had choices. My parents didn't have choices. They had to survive. And I don't resent I wasn't allowed to be fully myself, because at the end of the day, I grew into it. By the time I was in high school, like, I was very hyper self-aware of like who I was, where I was going. And like, it did have a lot to do with how they instilled community and music and activism around me.
Yeah. Well,
But I think
hold up, because
there was fear.
there's so much in there, right? So I think early on, our authenticity is often shaped by our family's expectations for us, right? Like you said, they had certain expectations of like, hey, you represent this family. I sacrifice this to give you this as a woman, as a Latina, as a this, and that. Like, what do you think were the expectations for you besides, you know, not getting pregnant at an early age?
Well, this is the thing. My parents they always knew I was not going to be that type of person. Yeah, like, I think when it came down to that, it was more like what society, how they viewed us. But like, for me, for example, like, I always knew I was going to college. Like, it was never an option. Like, since I was little, we would pass by Temple University or colleges, and I would ask like, oh, what is that? And like, you know, my dad saying like, oh, that's Temple University. Like, who knows, you might go there one day. Like, you're going to college, or, you know, saying simple stuff like that. It was just like, to me, it was so normalized that I would go to college. And I didn't realize that that's not a similar experience for a lot of people until I was older, because to me, it was just like, yeah, I'm going to college. Like, that's what you're supposed to do. And I ended up going to Temple University, which was like the crazier part. Was one of the best experiences that I had. I went to a community college first. So I had a very unorthodox experience when it came to school. I was in CCP, Community College Philadelphia, for a really long time. I didn't do a 4-year like a lot of other people. So I think the expectation for them was I was going to finish in 4 years. But again, by then, I was already building my authentic self. Like, I knew what my identity was. I was really strong. And when it came...
What does that mean? You were starting to build. What does that mean?
When I was starting to build, for example, my early 20s, especially after high school, like, I made it a point to really figure out, like, why do I think the way that I do? Why do I dress the way that I do? I went to a predominantly white high school, And it wasn't the greatest experience, but I think I definitely know that I needed that experience to understand what microaggression is, to understand how I exist in this world and how like diverse it is. Like even my existence is very diverse because my existence, the way I look, the way I talk is gonna come off different and it's gonna feel different depending in what environment I'm in. You know, like I grew up.
Tell me more about that. Like, what do you mean it feels different? Like you mentioned how you dress, how you look, how you talk, like,
Yeah.
and then like, when did you realize it was different?
So I grew up going to a multicultural school. Philadelphia, just like Chicago, has had very intense redlining, right? So a lot of our communities are segregated. I grew up in a very African American community, right? I was the only Latino family. And we had our bodega there, right? A few blocks away, I went to a school that was very multicultural. So it was African American, it was Asian, it was a lot of Latino immigrants that were there. So like white people were the minority in that school. My parents later moved to the northeast of Philadelphia, which at the time was predominantly white. And it was a changing space. You know, people of color were slowly moving in. And you know how white people get when people of color start moving in. In that school, I went to an all-girl school of like 600 girls. And out of the 600 girls, I think there was only like a handful. I can't say more than 10 of us that were people of color in general.
That's a big change.
And I think at the time I was the only Dominican in a sea of like 600 girls, you know, and I went from going to a school that, you know, there was Caribbean people, there were people from South America, to a space that was just like super, super white and culturally super different compared to what I grew up to. And it really, you know, I realized I had a bit of a distorted view of like what the world is, you know, like I always understood traveling because again, like I have family in New Jersey, I have family in New York, and then I would go to DR. But again, these were bubbles where people looked like me. People knew my cultural references and people understood what I was talking about, right? And when I stepped into college, I feel like so many things were happening around that time that started making really like altering, like, okay, why do I vote a specific party? Why do I believe in God? Or is this something that was just implemented in me? And like, you know, I went to Catholic school for 12 years.
Me too. Me too. I went to all boys Catholic high school, so I feel you.
Oh yeah, so mine was an all Catholic girl high school, and like I think one of the pivotal moments of you know my high school years was the first time they spoke about sex to us, and it was just like, you know, around this time I was really thinking about abortion rights, and like, you know, just a year before I remember going to like a pro-life rally, and like being at the pro-life rally, like it had me thinking like something's not feeling right. You know, one of the reasons why is because one, if we went, I would get extra credit for theology class. So I was doing it more for the credit for my class.
Interesting. Okay. Right.
And then, you know, like I'm thinking about what they're saying and everything. And then it's just like, wow, like, again, I'm like 15 at this pro-life march. And I'm like, I started really thinking about why I was there. You know, I was 15.
Like you're being sort of pushed to learn about this ideology, but it's really for like class credit versus like you actually being like,
exactly,
want to learn about
like,
this kind of thing.
To me, I just did it more because I wanted to pass theology.
Of course.
You
Yeah.
know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But that day, like, I really started thinking about like, bro, like, if my friend right now got pregnant, I would want her to get an abortion. These were some of my thoughts that were going on in my head while I was there at that rally for extra credit for theology class.
Yeah.
You know, and it was like little moments like that. And like, even being in a Catholic space and dealing with discrimination and stereotypes where it's just like, how is it that we all believe in the same God, but you think you're superior than me or my people? You know, certain things like that. So I feel like moments like that started to really alter the way I viewed the world. It was also, you know, like immigration. the conversation around immigration was so big around that time. President Obama was, you know, he was running for office. So again, like I'm in a sea of white people and they're all just like, people are just voting for him because he's black. And I'm like, but do you know why your family's voting for the other person? Like, you know, and being in those classes where it was just like, I was always the only person of color. Like, I felt like I had to be the voice and like the defender of everyone, of like Asian Americans, of like African. I'm like, anytime something smart was said, I feel like I would have to say something. I didn't realize how much it drained me. Like I would come home like exhausted, like mentally exhausted, and I didn't understand what it was. I didn't understand what was going on with me, but it was emotional labor. I was doing a lot of emotional labor, facing people with a specific way of thinking. You know, I remember hearing comments like, oh, Mexicans are stealing all our jobs and like illegal immigrants are stealing all our jobs. And I'm like, you're not even working. You're not even allowed to work yet. Like, where's this coming from? Are your parents saying this? So that really started to alter the way I thought about the world. And by the time I hit college, I just knew that like, I knew I could be a better person. There was a lot of things that were limiting me and that like felt like there was so much I just didn't understand about myself. And that opened like one door, right? Then I got one of my first jobs.
Wait, before we get into work too, like you mentioned kind of like the difficulties and like, awkwardness maybe in classes, right? But you also alluded to like growing up at some point, like people made you feel like other, or like you had a very early experience around like microaggressions, right?
Yeah, I mean,
what were some of those instances where you were just like, oh, I remember that comment?
yeah, I mean, I've always felt other.
Before we get into that, let's take a quick break and tell you about Plurawl. We created the app to help you stop jumping to conclusions. That's right. It's very simple. You just vent, click one button, and we'll help you identify and overcome the limiting beliefs that you're holding on to. You see, there's data out there that says 80% of all of our thoughts as humans are negative, and 95% of them are repetitive. So on a daily basis, we are stuck in this endless loop of self-doubt. Plurawl will help you get out of those negative thought patterns so that you can get back to living your best life.
Even in the multicultural space, because for a really long time, there wasn't a big Dominican community in Philly. And I think that made me overly proud.
Really?
Because, you know, like there was always this beef between like nationalities in Latin America. People are always coming at people where they're from. And, you know, I remember sitting one day at someone's house. I'm not going to mention the nationality, but like I was there at a friend's house and her sister's friend was like, yeah, I mean, I just never met like a pretty Dominican woman. Mind you, I'm like sitting there and I'm like, hold on now. But also like she obviously didn't know I was Dominican because she was talking so freely. And I was like, why do you say that? Like, and she was just like, oh, because, you know, my stepdad is Dominican and like all those people are like super dark, like they're super black. So that was like my first interaction with like racism, colorism in the Latino context. And, you know, when I remember telling her like, I'm Dominican and she was like, oh, I mean, you're pretty. Like, that's not the case, you know? But I remember not singing enough because like it was just so much, like I was processing so much. So like, it's not like even being in a multicultural space, I never felt other. Like there were definitely moments, but I feel like once I stepped into like 10, 11, 12, like I started using it as my power. Like if people don't understand where I'm from, then I'm going to teach it. Like, you know, talent shows or moments where like I can really express who I was or where I come from. I took advantage of it. So I feel like in a storytelling aspect and the branding of who Jenny was, like I was pretty straight up by the time I was 12. I was very clear on that.
But there's such an interesting dynamic happening though, right? Because at some point here you are growing this like confidence and Dominicanness, all this kind of stuff, right? And then you're learning about yourself, and then you're in college though, probably, you know, about to graduate. You're like, oh, what do I do career wise, right? But also in college, you're also as confident as you're becoming and you're learning about yourself. You're also in these prestigious institutions where you start realizing maybe like, damn, if I want to quote unquote make it, maybe do I always have to be in like white spaces? You know what I mean? Am I ever going to work around people that look like me, right? And if I do continue to work in white spaces, which most of them are, especially if you're trying to, and for me at least, if I'm trying to get the bag, I got to work in spaces that where most people aren't going to look like me, right? But that if I go in those spaces, then can I be myself? Did you think about all those things as you were as you were looking for work?
It's crazy. And I had to go back to another childhood moment so I can bring it back. So this is the thing. And I'm very adamant about speaking to children positively.
Yeah.
Because it really makes an
so
impact.
important.
As I'm now in my 30s, there's so many impactful moments from my childhood that shaped me. And we really underestimate the power of the word when you are speaking to a child, because we are literally sponges, at 9 and 8. I really wanted to be on Disney Channel. Like, I wanted to be
Really?
yeah. I grew up dancing and stuff. Like, my parents really, what I will say is they created a world where we can be artistically free, but school was always first. And my dad would stay up and, my parents would stay up and search for castings. Like, I would search for castings and I always run it by them. And there was a back to school casting, and I always mention this because, again, any conversation can mold somebody. Casting was a back to school commercial, and it was asking for a Caucasian girl from 9 to 12 years old. And I was just like, I was reading Caucasian and I was like, what is that? And my dad was like, that means a white person. And I was just like, out loud, I remember saying like, oh, they don't know that, like, brown and black people. At the time, I think I used the term Hispanics because we used Hispanics more than Latino at the time. So I was like, they don't think black and Hispanic people don't go to school. And like, it was just like such a crazy moment for me to process, like, at 9 years old. And I remember my dad saw opportunity to tell me about the world and like remind me what expectations are and who gets to put those expectations. Because the first thing he said is, media's programming. They want you to feel like you don't belong there. Like, they want you to feel like this. They want you to see yourself not there so you can think that you don't have to go to school, that you don't have to go there. And he had a really big, powerful conversation around journalism, like, in writing. He's a journalist himself, so he took the opportunity. And even at 9 years old, like, those are one of those impactful memories that have never, like, left my brain because it altered the way I viewed TV shows, commercials, beauty brands. It made me question everything. And I'm grateful for that casting. Was it racist as hell? Yes, it was. But I'm grateful for it because it taught me at 9 that people weren't checking for us, that people didn't want us to feel seen, and that people wanted to program a whole generation of girls to think that a certain institution or a certain space wasn't for them. So
that must have maybe at such an early age gave you a sense of purpose around, maybe one day I will help shape what people's perception is. Because that's such a fascinating point, and I'm getting goosebumps around it. Like, advertising, media, like the images that we put out there into the world have a huge impact on how we view ourselves and how we view other people. So like, I'm starting to make the connection between like your dad being a journalist and being part of the programming, right, of like what people see in the world.
Absolutely.
And like him telling you about the power of it, you're like, oh shit, can I potentially do that as well? Like you saw that early on as like a career path for you.
Yeah, and I think honestly, he saw it in all of us too, because he had this newspaper that was called Recognizing that was for business owners. Like, that was the way he continued his passion for writing. And he would have my younger sister and I like either submit like little articles and stuff like that. He made it a point for us to read the articles in Spanish so that we wouldn't lose language and so that we can understand how to read. So he definitely played a role in that. Like, I could never take that away from my daddy. And he is.
We'll go for it.
I don't remember what I was gonna say.
I was gonna say, all right. So let's fast forward. You don't have to name where the job is.
Okay.
I like to talk about things in like realities, right? So I would just say earlier in your career,
yeah,
there's a lot of pressure on us, right? Like this job, we want people to accept us, we want to do a good job, etc. How did you show up? What was your corporate swag looking like?
Okay. So my first media gig, I was swagged out. Okay.
Really?
I was like that. I would wear sneakers and blazers. And like, I remember at the time, a lot of other journalists would hit me up like, girl, like, you are inspiring me. Because the thing is, when my first media job was People in Espanol, there was a vertical called People Chica, and we did a lot of English language content. So it definitely was one of those jobs that I was just like, okay, this I got because of my authentic self. Like, it was because of what I was already doing in Philly. And right before.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
So while I was in Philly, again, I had a very unorthodox college experience. I think I took like 7 years to graduate. But that's because, again, I'm ADHD. The structure of higher education isn't created for the way that I like to learn. So I would sometimes take 2 courses a semester. I would do an internship, and then I had 2 jobs. So I was like, the type of dopamine and the lifestyle that I had without me being diagnosed, because I was diagnosed at 28, I created a lifestyle and a learning experience that I felt great in, that I knew I could thrive in.
So you were heavy on like getting the experience while you studied as
Yes.
well, right? Like,
Well, I
yeah,
was really
okay.
immersed in like fashion. I had a fashion clothing brand because I know how to sew clothes from scratch. So I would make swimsuits. And then I also was interning in a few places, like with Philly music being at the core center of it, of like localizing and organizing community around music.
All
You
right.
know, these were,
So by the time you start working, you already had a whole portfolio
yeah, in
of
terms of
shit.
like, yeah, like of conversations, because I had a website where like I spoke about Dominican identity, Afro-Latino, Caribbean identity, fashion, and then also politics. Because again, like when I graduated college, this was the era around Trumpism, Trump against, like, it was Trump against Hillary, and like that was another era that really radicalized me. So all these
Wait, hold up. So all these things are happening though,
yes,
but there's got
think about it. It's like a lot of things intersecting at the same time.
well, I'm really curious around like, you know, we're looking at things in hindsight. So now you have the hindsight to be like, yeah, you know, ADHD, I did this because of that. But at the time, were people looking at you like, girl, finish school? And like, were you comparing yourself to folks?
No, yeah,
Were
absolutely.
you comparing?
People were confused, like, and I think I had a lot of
And like, how did you get through that? Like, how did you have those conversations? Like,
I
and you're like, I just got over that shit.
I didn't have the tools. I remember I actually tried to get the help. I went twice, and both times I got diagnosed with anxiety and major depression. What people never, because, you know, to some people I was gifted, you know, like they saw that certain areas of my life I did really well, and it was because I was masking, and the anxiety spawned out of me masking because I was putting in extra energy, putting extra thought, doing the most to make sure that I appeared neurotypical. You know what I mean? And both times when I went, I was told that I had anxiety and major depression. And it was never the root of it until quarantine, where like during COVID, I got super, like, it was bad. I was having panic attacks. It was the first year of me freelancing. And then I went out to get help, and like I had an inkling that I had ADHD because I was doing so much research. And a friend of mine also got diagnosed, and I was just like, she has too many, like we have too many similarities. So when I look at it in hindsight, you know, everyone looked at me as a mess. I have a younger sister that is 4 years younger than me, and everyone kept comparing me to her, like, oh, she's gonna beat you. You know, like the Latino family.
Like they would say
Yeah,
that.
Latino families say things like that, like, oh, she's gonna beat you, or like, how is it that you're taking forever? Or like you're very not just disorganized, but like you are deteriorating. Like, what was the word that they used? Pretty much that like the creative world was taking up too much space in my mind. But in reality, the creative world was like keeping me alive, you know, because it was the passion and light that I needed at the time to like be able to survive a world that didn't understand me in a time that I didn't even understand that part of me, if that makes sense. You get what I'm saying?
So they were looking at it potentially as like, yo, this little hobby thing that you're doing is cool, but like get a real job kind of shit.
Well, the thing is, I always had like certain jobs that kind of added to that, like, oh, like honorable type of mention. If you know,
isn't that crazy?
Like,
isn't that wild that like
they didn't
we see,
and they felt that if I didn't prioritize so much creative energy and like mingling in the music world, I would be more far ahead. Like, people just didn't understand it. And it did hurt me. It did cause depression, but I don't know, man. Like, I really made it an intention to like really get through it. And when I look back at like a lot of my high school journals and my early college year journals, like I manifested everything I've ever done to a T. That is just like, there isn't one thing that I wrote down in my high school senior book that's published that everybody got. There's nothing that I didn't write in my early journals that I did not achieve. Like I achieved everything that I ever wanted to do. And I achieved so ahead that like the first 2 years of my journalism experience, I literally did everything I ever wanted to do. That's why to me right now, like I know that for the world, it's like that girl does too many things. It's messy, but it's just like I had a set list of goals. I did it. And now I'm on to the next day that's gonna keep everything afloat and together. To answer your question, I did not feel okay. The way that I fought through it was reminding myself and validating myself. I think that era really taught me how to validate myself.
Versus seeking the external validation.
Because sometimes we do things just for other people. To me, that I only went to Temple University for 1 year. And you're supposed to do 2. Like the ideal situation is you do 2 years at a community college and 2 years at Temple. I overdid my semesters. I did more than 6 classes a semester, and I did summer and winter. So I was heads on in school for that entire year. And to me, I look back at it now and I'm like, wow, I was able to do that, still be able to be part of like the broadcast clubs and do live broadcasting and still practice what this career world would kind of look like for me in a way that is just like other people wouldn't have been able to do it. I was running on coffee and low sleep and I had the worst anxiety. So mentally I was not okay. Was I able to do it? Hell yes. I did it and it looked great. Mentally it was one of the worst I've ever been.
Yeah. No, listen, so much of what you said resonates from like me or like what other people have told us, especially that idea of like whether you got a younger cousin or a younger sibling or, there's this abuela got a friend at church and they got a niece that is doing some shit. And you're like, why aren't you doing that? And it's like, we could all win. Like, it's not a competition.
Exactly. And that's why I said that taught me how to validate myself. Because at the end of the day, the reason why I got the first job in the first place in media was because I came from a world of so many different experiences, because I was in music, because I was creative and understood how the fashion world works, and because I was socially, politically aware. These were all things that were happening at the same time. I don't think I would have stepped into media the way that I did if it wasn't for the decisions I made at 20 that everyone questioned. And so proud of that, because I proved myself right. Like, I try not to say prove them wrong. I always say prove yourself right, because you need to validate yourself. Because at the end of the day, when you're saying, if I'm doing something for somebody else, like, you're doing it for them and their validation, But
I love that.
So
by the time you started working, you said like you going in there, you said they get swagged out. Is that because you had the confidence of like, listen, I've already done so much that like, what are people going to tell me? Is that why?
Yeah, because I already had so many experiences. Like, for example, and let me just say this. I was confident, but I was still younger and I still I still was experiencing imposter syndrome. Like, when I stepped into Meredith, when you step into Meredith and it's literally like you're in a movie. Like the first day, it's like, holy hell, like, holy shit. You know what I mean? Like, oh my God.
No, tell me, what do you mean?
Like you're seeing all these covers, you're seeing these screens of like Sports Illustrated, Time, and it's like it's like when you're seeing The Hills or like The Devil Wears Prada or one of those shows like that we grew up watching, and after the first day it just becomes normal. It's like anything, like it's like whatever. But the first time, like me being a girl from Philly, when nobody from my graduating class really had jobs. It was a time there was so much uncertainty around journalism, around broadcast journalism. for me to experience that, like, even for me to get the interview, like, I was just like, if I don't get it, it's okay. But once I step in here, like, I already know that this is possible. Like, I already did it. Like, it's possible for me to get an interview in a traditional publication or any type of media gig because I just did it. So after that, like, I felt unstoppable. Yeah. And before that, I still felt that type of imposter syndrome because it's like, oh, am I good enough or am I doing enough, But when it comes to the swag down and the appearance, like, I set those hard boundaries right before accepting my first media gig because I already had corporate experiences that wrecked my hair. Like, for example, like the concept around hair always came up throughout my career because at first I was in hard news and in broadcast. And, I don't know how, a lot of things are changing. I see a lot of women with natural hair as anchors and as weather women. But at the time, there was the anchor look. You had to have a certain color. You couldn't get highlights. Certain colors were off the table. So you didn't have creative liberation when it came to your hair, to the way you dress. There's a specific way that you have to dress. And then also, like, would I be able to wear my natural hair? You know what I mean?
Even red hair, right? Like,
yeah, like, downtown. I don't know how that looked like.
were those, because sometimes there are like actual rules and then there are like the unspoken rules where it's not official, but everyone knows because like everyone has the same look kind of thing.
I never read a handbook or anything that
right.
print, but it was just like,
right.
I had friends that were already working on the field where it was just like I was told to get rid of my highlights or like, stuff like that. And I was working in corporate for something specifically different at the time. And it was under a Dominican woman, a Dominican white woman. And, sometimes it be your own, all kinfolk. But she told me that my hair looked messy and unprofessional. And I came from a line of like, even in Catholic school, there were times where people tried to belittle the way I looked or that I didn't look as polished because of my hair. When they would ask if I had a scrunchie so I could put my hair up, I said no all the time because I'm like, y'all gonna have to see this hair. And also culturally in Dominican communities, when you're about to go to a party or an event, you always go to the salon because that's what was the norm at the time. And, I really wanted to keep this specific job because, again, I'm doing all these different things and it was the thing that like kept everyone happy. It was like,
because you could, even in like American culture, there's such a thing of like early on in the conversation is like, what do you do?
Yeah.
Right. And I always share this funny example, right? Like back when I was working at like Facebook or TikTok, I would get excited on dates for women to ask me where I worked. But then when I left, I used to be embarrassed a little bit to be like, entrepreneur?
Yeah.
But that's just in my head, right? Like, but there's a certain level of like confidence when I would like, even for my mom, I'd be like, oh, now my mom could be like, yeah, her son works here. Like, but it's like, what does that matter?
Yeah. It's the social, like the social label and like the social awareness that people have. Again, it's like people validating us, like, and in a way we do manipulate ourselves when we are in these industries. We do become master manipulators in a way that like we get too consumed by our roles. And, again, like when I first accepted that job, I was very clear on like, I will not straighten my hair until I scored my first on-camera interview. And I didn't straighten my hair for almost a year. And I scored my first on-camera interview thanks to Isabelia Herrera, who's also a Dominican woman. And it was live. It was with that De La Ghetto. And I remember posting it and it being such a big moment because everyone was just like, this is so you. Like the outfit, the hair, like, and so many people were part of my journey in school, throughout school, my struggles, my hair journey, getting it from like super fried to like curly hair. So I felt like that moment wasn't just like a win for me. It was a win for community because it was just like, bro, like Jenny did it. Like she got what she wanted and she looks herself. She's speaking like herself. She's being herself. Again, like I grew up in an era where we code switched. That was survival. It was political. So it was, you know, respectability politics, and it was political for us, and it was survival for us, you know? And when I first stepped in, I said, I'm gonna exist the way that I exist, and I'm not gonna straighten my hair until I get my first interview, like on camera interview. Cause I want to prove that to myself, but I also want people to know that it's possible, you know? And it was almost like I was doing that for that, like, little 9-year-old that didn't see herself reflected in that casting. You get what I'm saying? Like, now I reflect that and I see, like, you know, all of these things are happening at the same times and the intersecting. But again, like that first on camera live interview, like I always reflect back on it. And it was such a pivotal moment because I'm like, that's me with my curly hair, interviewing somebody that I listened to during the most foundational years that really formed me and kind of even bringing that up in the conversation. Like it was one of those moments where I was just like, yeah, like any space I step into, I'm going to be the most authentic self my most authentic self. And I honestly think that's why I don't really last in corporate. I don't care. I don't care. I work with corporate a lot as a consultant, but to be an actual entity in corporate is just not for me. And that's okay for me to know that. You know, I'm very clear on my goals. I'm also clear on my life goals. I'm clear on my values and my beliefs. And like, I'm very hard, like it's a hard yes or hard no when it comes to my values. Like I really value authenticity, which is the main conversation, not just out of me, but from people. And corporate's all a game of chess. I don't have time to.
It's a lot.
I don't have time to think about all the respectability of the politics of everything. I don't have time for that. To me, I show up as who I am, and if I see that people don't show up as who they are to exist in the corporate space, then that's already like it's a turn off. You know, I value authenticity, community. Sorry, I value authenticity, community, goals, growing. You know, legacy building, honesty, and like there's so much more in my list of values that sometimes corporate don't fully align with that. And I feel that like when you are truly authentic to who you are and your values, you don't seem to sometimes thrive in these spaces because they cut that out. And I really, really admire people that can still exist in those spaces because I don't want to talk bad about it. I just think that for me, because I value my values and I'm heads on when it comes to my values and the world that I want for myself and my mental health, I know it's not fully a space for me yet. There probably is a space, but as of now, I haven't seen a space that is just like Jenny can exist there.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm just like the eternal optimist, but I think the spaces are out there, but it's just difficult to find. I mean, I equate it to dating. It's like, yeah, like I think Bay is out there. It's gonna take a long time to find her. You know what I mean? Like, but I think oftentimes, like, listen, you go on enough dates, you have enough jobs where you just like, man, fuck this, I'm good. You know what I mean? But I think it's really interesting and such an important point that I want to end on because we often talk about authenticity in reference to like people not fucking with it and like the resistance and the microaggressions. But I think it's really important to recognize like people see you and they're kind of like almost like taken aback or almost like shocked a little bit. They're like, hold up, she being herself. Like, maybe I could, right? Like, tell me a little bit about some of the positive and like comments or like, damn, like, girl, you inspired me. I didn't even know people could do that shit.
Yeah. I mean, like, there's younger Dominican journalists, there's younger Dominican content creators and women that love fashion that like constantly reach out to me or have reached out to me and said like, I'm doing this because I saw myself in you. You know what I mean? And I'm just like, ooh, period. Mic drop. And you know, like existing the way that I do is so empowering because another reason, you know, again, corporate, I do feel like there might be a world for me one day. But right now, I am so empowered by being an entrepreneur and independent freelancer because I can say no. If something's not for me, I can say no. If I know that a certain artist or certain company don't align with my values, I can say no. And when you are in that, when you're not in that space, especially for someone like me, again, like everyone has their own set of values and everyone has their own way of navigating career. For me, it's always been important for the ability to say no and for me to show up how I am.
Yo, that wraps up another episode of the Plurawl podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please do us a favor, leave a rating and a review wherever you're listening. It's going to help make sure that people find us and hear these stories so that we can finally redefine professionalism.